We have a lot to cover in today's video, including more information on Taylor Hall. The Bruins appear to be somewhat disappointed in David Pastrnak. Plus, Max Domi's back for the Montreal Canadiens. The Flyers have signed Oskar Lindblom. We have all that and more coming up next. So welcome back to another video here at Top Shelf Hockey. Now, as I mentioned, we have a lot of different news topics to cover today around the NHL. Let's kick things off with the news from the Montreal Canadiens that Max Domi has officially announced that he is definitely going to play. He's been practicing over the last few days with Montreal, and he is definitely going to be in for the Habs, which is actually some pretty big news. I think Montreal without Max Domi would have been, certainly in tough against Pittsburgh. They might be in tough anyway. It's going to be a tough series, but obviously when you have a goaltender like Carey Price in the net, who has the ability to steal games, anything is possible. The Penguins have had their fair share of issues going through training camp and players not being available for different reasons too. So you just never know. But without Domi, that certainly changes things a little bit. Obviously, that's going to create a hole down the middle if he's not going to be playing. He's been a pretty good center iceman for them over the last couple of years here. So clearly that means a lot for Jesperi Kotkaniemi as well. More than likely for these playoffs, he's either going to be playing wing, possibly be a healthy scratch, but I think they're leaning towards playing him on the wing rather than sitting him out. It seems like he certainly deserves an opportunity to be in the lineup. I know there was a lot of chatter already about him not being at center ice, since that was the position he played when he was drafted, and a position that I believe Montreal does see him and want him to be in longer term. But for right now, in the short term, for him to be in the lineup, if he needs to be on the wing, it's really not a big deal. A lot of guys get drafted as center icemen, have to play some wing, work their way into a more permanent spot as they continue to grow and develop. So good news for Max Domi, good news for Montreal. So we'll see how they do here against the Pittsburgh Penguins, but certainly a lot of risk on Domi's part. He certainly also acknowledged that he doesn't expect other type 1 diabetic players to necessarily follow in his lead. They can make their own choices, but he certainly weighed all the risk involved and decided that it's worth it for him to make an attempt to play here. Now, as I mentioned as well, in regards to training camps and different players being available and whatnot, the Boston Bruins have made it known through Cam Neely, their team president, that he's somewhat disappointed in guys like David Pastrnak and Ondrej Kase, who have not been available to practice so far in Phase 3 of the return to play, and they may not be available into Phase 4. And right now, it's not entirely clear what their playing future holds in the short term, if they're going to be available or what's going to happen. It's been mentioned before. There's been information and pictures circulating through social media that Pastrnak and Kase had worked out on their own at a different non-Bruins facility. Could have possibly been exposed to some COVID-19, so they've had to isolate, and I don't believe there's been any kind of positive test or anything of that nature, but I know obviously when you have to isolate, it can be up to 2 weeks because of how this virus works, and Cam Neely just seemed to be a little frustrated and disappointed in their actions. Wish they would have made better choices, and that could have a major impact on Boston. I mean, David Pastrnak is one of the top goal scorers in the league. Clearly, without him in their lineup, that's going to be a big blow. Of course, the Bruins are going to be competing for those top 4 spots in the early going, and then they'll go into round 1. So, I mean, they're going to have a little bit longer to kind of get themselves going here. I mean, if Pasternak's available, but, not at the very beginning, it's not the end of the world. But at the same time, if Pastrnak hasn't been able to practice and participate in a lot of these drills with the team, it's certainly going to have an impact on how sharp he is and, just the overall impact here on the franchise. So certainly Neely has made it known that he's not real pleased, and we'll see how this impacts the Bruins longer term as we get closer to the playoffs starting up. Now, as we found out today as well, great news for Philadelphia Flyers forward Oskar Lindblom, who of course will recently beat cancer and finally get to ring the bell in his final treatment, and he was rewarded today with a 3-year contract extension with the Philadelphia Flyers, paying him an average annual value of $3 million. So the 23-year-old left winger for Philadelphia had certainly been coming on strong to be a pretty good part of their team. Obviously, 2 seasons ago had played a full year, had some pretty good production, scored 17 goals. This year, early in the season, before he had to stop playing when the diagnosis came to be, his stats were looking pretty good again. Would have been on pace to do an even better season this year. But of course, unfortunately, his health had other plans, and he had to miss the rest of the year. But he's fought hard, and he's certainly been rewarded as well with a nomination for the Bill Masterton Trophy. Of course, we saw saw numerous other great stories around the NHL as well, and he'll be up against guys like Stephen Johns and Bobby Ryan of the Ottawa Senators for that award, and they all kind of deserve it really in their own way. It's not often we see so many great stories of perseverance and battling back like we did with these three guys this year. Really, I'd be quite content if they just called it a three-way tie and gave them all the trophy, because they've all deserved it, like, for all very different reasons as well. So obviously that's great news for Oskar. Nice to see him get rewarded there. Doesn't look like he's going to be able to play in these playoffs, but he should be good to go and back in action for next season. Now we have a few off-season rumors to talk about as well, including the Dallas Stars. Now, it's been well known and documented that their backup goaltender, Anton Khudobin, has been one of the best backup goalies in the NHL really for some time, and especially the last couple of years. This past season, he had the best save percentage in the NHL. Now, Khudobin, of course, is getting up there in years, going to be 34 years old, needs a new contract, he's a pending UFA, and Dallas, like many teams, are going to have some tough decisions to make when it comes to new contracts, because they're all going to have be very tight on cap space. Now, in Khudobin's case, though, there's a unique set of circumstances here that might cause this difficult decision for Dallas. I mean, I'd say they likely would want to retain him. He's expressed interest to stay in Dallas as well. They have no reason to want to break up the goaltending tandem of Bishop and Khudobin. But, it's longer term, it's going to be complicated. Because of his age, he's 34, he's not 35 yet, so he's going to still be 34 when the next contract is signed. So he's not eligible for a 35-plus contract where he can get a lot of bonuses built in. So sometimes those kind of guys will take less on the salary but earn the extra money in the bonuses. Kind of gives the team a little bit more flexibility with the cap. They can kind of spread things out a little bit between one season and the next, but that's not going to be a possibility. They're likely not going to be interested in more than a one-year term, I would think, if you're Dallas, because of a couple reasons. They have to be cautious here for the expansion draft, because if they have Bishop and Khudobin under contract for multiple years, they're going to have to expose one in the expansion draft to Seattle. Likely could lose one, so that's a problem that they got to be wary of. And secondly, too, they have a young prospect goaltender, Jake Ottinger, who's really pretty close to being ready. I mean, I would think after one more year that he's definitely going to be ready for a pretty solid role in the NHL, likely as a backup first, and then eventually has potential to be the next full-time starting goaltender. So they'll have to see how he does with his development. But Ottinger's done well enough that he's going to be looking for an opportunity and deserves to have one within the next year as well. So, and Bishop's not super young either, so they need to give a guy like Ottinger a chance so that in a few years' time, when Bishop's ready to move on from being the starter, that they have that next guy in place. So there's some tough decisions there. Khudobin certainly wants to stay in Dallas. It's in their best interest to keep him, but will he agree to a one-year deal, or will another team give him a little bit more term and security at his age that he's looking for? I mean, it's going to be enticing for him to be looking around on the market. There's plenty of teams. There's going to be a very active goaltender market this offseason. I have no doubt about that. We could probably see several goaltenders changing teams, especially in the backup role, maybe a few starters as well. And, if somebody comes along and offers him a 3-year contract, maybe even a 4-year contract, it's going to be tough for him to pass up. Because what if he gets hurt next year? There's a lot of risk for him as a player too. So be interesting to see if Dallas can keep their goaltending tandem in place. Because if they lose Khudobin, even though longer term they'll probably be okay, short term it's going to hurt. Especially where Bishop sometimes can be injury prone. You need a guy who can take over and play more games than the average backup, which they have right now. And if he's not there, that's going to be awfully tough for them to be able to replace. Now I also want to touch quickly on the Winnipeg Jets. As we know, they acquired defenseman Demelo from the Ottawa Senators ahead of the NHL trade deadline, and he did fit in quite nicely there before the NHL season was paused. I know his coach Paul Maurice was very pleased with him. He was a solid top 4 addition. He's a pending unrestricted free agent, which is why Ottawa was looking to move him. They weren't confident that they were going to re-sign him. The Sens have a lot of defensive prospects in the system who need more opportunity, and really, for him, does he want to continue going through this rebuild, or did he want to move on? It wasn't really clear, so they traded him to Winnipeg, who was in desperate need of some help on the blue line, and said he kind of just fit like a glove there, and obviously he probably would like to stay. In an interview recently with Demelo, he basically said that there hasn't been a whole lot of talks right now, kind of letting that go until the season is over, focused on the playoffs, which is where his head really should be right now. But there's certainly some talk about Winnipeg probably not doing anything too crazy during the offseason, but signing Demelo would make sense to be one of their top priorities. He's only making $900,000 right now. He's been playing in the NHL on some pretty cheap contracts since coming out of his ELC, but he's definitely going to be looking for a decent raise after the year he had. He get to play a pretty big role in Ottawa before he was traded, and then fitting quite nicely with the Jets. And I wouldn't be surprised if he's looking for, a 3 or 4 year contract with around maybe $3.5 million. I can see that being a reasonable asking price for a guy like Demelo. So will Winnipeg keep Demelo in the fold? That's certainly worth their while to do so, and I guess we'll have to wait until the offseason to find out for sure. Now, we have new reports today as well, following up on what we talked about yesterday in regards to Taylor Hall. Of course, as we discussed yesterday, in case you missed it, there was talk that there was somewhat of a fairly low-profile dinner meeting between Taylor Hall and Coyotes ownership and their new COO. But GM John Chayka was not present at the meeting. More talk today saying that it was because he was not invited, and obviously the new CEO that Alex Murillo hired is a real good friend of his. They've known each other a long time. They've done a lot of business together, and even though he's new to the hockey world, he's not new to the business world, and he's been a really solid negotiator for Murillo in their different business ventures in the past, and he has a lot of trust in him. And obviously where this Taylor Hall situation is a very delicate one, it could be a big altering moment for the franchise, whether they sign him or they lose him after giving up a lot to obtain him. I guess maybe he feels more secure with him doing the negotiating, but it is odd that his own general manager at least wasn't involved. I could see maybe having extra parties involved, including him as the owner, but to not even have Chayka in the room seems a little bit odd, and there's certainly a lot of talk around that. But there was more reports I've seen in a couple different places today discussing what NHL sources were saying that they offered to Taylor Hall, and I guess we'll have to wait and find out what is true and what isn't. There was one report indicating that an NHL source said that the Coyotes ownership offered him between 5 and 8 years. It was a longer term deal in the $7+ million range, so somewhere around 7 to 7.5 million likely would be that number. Now that's not all that unreasonable. Personally, as we discussed in yesterday's video, I cautioned against Arizona or any team really signing Hall to a big time, $8, $9, $10 million long-term deal. Obviously, I'm just not sure that he's that prime player to build around. I see Taylor Hall as more of a complimentary piece. I know he had that 1 year in New Jersey where he kind of put the team on his back, led them to the playoffs, won the Hart Trophy. But really, that's the only year he's been in the NHL that he's really accomplished anything like that. He's a great hockey player. Don't get me wrong. I love Taylor Hall as a player. I just don't see him being that elite level player like a Sidney Crosby or a Connor McDavid or a Nathan MacKinnon that you can really build around and be that centerpiece. Like I said, in yesterday's video, same thing with Phil Kessel. At one point in his career, he was looked upon that when he was traded to Toronto, and then expectations were way higher than what was realistic. Never worked out. He had some great years. I mean, Kessel was a scoring machine in Toronto, but as a team, they never saw the success that they were looking for. He often got the brunt of the criticism and really kind of ended up driving him out of town. He goes to Pittsburgh as a complimentary piece where he's the third or fourth best player and excelled to no end, winning multiple Stanley Cups, had some awesome offensive seasons, and I think Taylor Hall could be in a situation to do the same sort of thing. And now you get a Hall and Kessel together, both trying to kind of jointly be the guy there, and it just hasn't worked out. Like, the Coyotes got worse after they acquired Taylor Hall, which is kind of odd, even though Hall, as a player himself, his numbers were still pretty decent. So, obviously, I guess we'll see. Now, the other offer I saw was that the Coyotes were prepared to pay upwards of $10 million to Taylor Hall. I'm not sure how confident I am in that report. At this point, with the flat salary cap and the NHL landscape and the market really being altered by this pause due to the pandemic, I'd be surprised if he gets anywhere near $10 million. Now, if anything, if the season would have finished as normal and we wouldn't have had this pandemic, I could see a team coming out and offering that, because sometimes things get a little crazy during free agency and you see teams overpaying to keep or overpaying to bring in a free agent. And unfortunately, a lot of times it just doesn't work out. They overpay, they later regret it, and it has a big impact, oftentimes negative, on the franchise for a long, long time. But I do find it very interesting that Chayka is not invited to this meeting. It looks as though that the negotiations are going to continue that way in Arizona, and I guess we'll see if they're offering big money like either of these deals. They can get him closer to $7 million on a 4 or 5 year deal. That to me is somewhat reasonable. They could still have enough cap space to build around them, but they're still going to have to shed salary regardless of what they do. They're really in tight against the cap. There's like no room for next season, and they have a few other guys that they need to sign they're all going to be smaller deals as well. But still, the Coyotes need space. They need it badly, and they'd have to move out a couple of players. Like I said yesterday, prime candidates would be like Derek Stepan, maybe Inti Ranta, and that would be enough room to keep Hall if they can work it out. But let me know what your thoughts are. If these rumors are true that Hall was offered a long-term deal at $7 million or a shorter-term deal at $10 million, what do you think is realistic here? What can the Coyotes do to keep Taylor Hall in the organization? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments, and we'll continue the discussion further. If you're new to the channel, consider subscribing and turning on your notifications so you don't miss any future content, and give the video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. I'd appreciate it if you did. As always, thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next time.